May 7th, 1915, on board the RMS Lusitania. At exactly 2:10 p.m., a torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side in between the first and second funnel. At the exact moment of impact, 350 pounds worth of explosives located within the torpedo detonated instantly. The resulting explosion exceeded temperatures of 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit or roughly 5,000 degrees Celsius. Now, when you factor in the high temperatures of this explosion, and you also factor in the pressure put on the Lusitania's hull at the site where this torpedo hit the ship, well, the Lusitania's hull was little more than tissue paper against these forces. The resulting explosion immediately breached 2 or more of the Lusitania's 12 watertight compartments, immediately allowing tons of seawater to begin flooding into the Lusitania's hull.
Now, just to give you all a better idea into how massive of a hole this torpedo left in the Lusitania's hull below the waterline actually was, well, some estimates think that this hole was roughly the size of a small house. Imagine how much seawater could get into a ship through a hole that big below the waterline. Now, even though most of the damage to the Lusitania was below the waterline, there was some small amounts of damage caused to the Lusitania's upper decks as a result of this torpedo impact as well. You see, at the exact moment that this torpedo struck the Lusitania's hull, it sent a massive geyser of water shooting up higher up than the ship itself. And located within this geyser was all kinds of small bits of debris caused by this torpedo detonation. So you had bits of rope, bits of metal, parts of the torpedo itself, all of the stuff that got blasted off of the ship and the torpedo was sent up into the air with this geyser. Now, because the Lusitania was traveling at roughly 18 knots at the exact moment the torpedo went off, this caused a lot of this debris to rain all around the ship as the Lusitania continued forward through this geyser. And another thing that happened was lifeboat number 5 on the Lusitania's starboard side, well, this lifeboat was stored on the deck directly above the point that the torpedo detonated. And the resulting detonation basically blasted this lifeboat to atoms. There wasn't a trace of it left on the ship after the torpedo went off. Now, the damage to the Lusitania's hull below the waterline went way further than just this giant hole that we discussed earlier. A lot of the rivets that were located near the site where this torpedo detonated broke loose, which allowed even more water to flood even more spaces of the Lusitania's interior area. And the porthole windows located near the site of detonation, well, all of these porthole windows and the glass within them, well, this glass shattered, which means that once the Lusitania sank so low that these porthole windows went underwater, the water would have even more means to access the ship's interior. Now, in the interior spaces of the ship, well, the damage down below the waterline in these areas was pretty extensive as well. Many of the Lusitania's watertight compartments were damaged by the force of the explosion, and many of the watertight doors located in these compartments were dislodged, which means they couldn't close them properly. So these compartments were no longer watertight. Now, even though we discussed earlier in this video that it's most likely that 2 watertight compartments were directly opened up to the sea by this giant hole in the ship's hull caused by a torpedo impact, I would say that when you factor in all these other variables, I'd say at least 3 watertight compartments were opened up to the sea when this torpedo struck the Lusitania's hull.
Now, immediately following the torpedo impact, the ship began to take on a very sharp list to starboard. This list happened so quickly that the crew of the Lusitania really didn't have any time to react to it at all. They were still trying to recover from what had just happened with the torpedo, and now, immediately following that, the ship starts listing. But within 10 seconds of the torpedo striking the Lusitania's hull, the Lusitania started leaning to her starboard side. The ship stabilized with a list of 15 degrees to starboard. That right there should tell you how much water was now flooding inside of the Lusitania, immediately following the torpedo detonation.
Now, the reason why the Lusitania took this sharp list to starboard so soon after the torpedo detonation was because of the Lusitania's longitudinal bulkheads. And in case you don't remember what a longitudinal bulkhead is, I'll explain. You see, the interior spaces of the Lusitania were separated by 12 individual watertight compartments. And of these 12 watertight compartments, any 2 could be breached and the ship would not sink. But when they were building the Lusitania, they decided to add another safety feature to the ship. And what these safety features were called were longitudinal bulkheads, which means that there were additional watertight bulkheads placed along the inner hull of the Lusitania. And what they also decided to do with these bulkheads built along the inner hull was use them as coal bunkers. So what ended up happening was, when the torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side and damaged those longitudinal bulkheads, even though these bulkheads weren't watertight anymore, when the torpedo hit it, the water still filled up these bulkheads first before it spilled into the rest of the interior spaces of the ship. But as that water rapidly flooded those longitudinal bulkheads along the ship's starboard side, the weight of the water in those bulkheads dragged the ship over to her starboard side. This is why the Lusitania developed such a sharp list to starboard so soon after the torpedo detonation.
And if you thought things couldn't get any worse for the Lusitania so soon after the torpedo detonation, remember it's only been 10 seconds ship time since the torpedo went off. Well, guess what? They could. You see, as the Lusitania took on this very sharp list to starboard, a good number of the porthole windows on the Lusitania's starboard side went underwater almost instantly. And the reason why this was such a big problem for the ship was because it was such a nice day outside and a good number of the Lusitania's passengers had opened up the porthole windows in their staterooms before leaving their cabins for the day. And what you need to remember is every single porthole window that was left open on the ship, well, as soon as it dipped beneath the surface, each window could let in an estimated 3 tons of seawater per minute. Now, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but some estimates believe that there could have been as many as 70 open porthole windows on the ship's starboard side that went underwater almost instantly following the torpedo detonation. So when you factor in that many windows open, and then you times that by 3 tons of seawater per minute, just think about how much water was flooding the Lusitania's interior so soon after the torpedo detonation. So, needless to say, the Lusitania very quickly hit the maximum amount of flooding the ship could take within her interior and not sink, and quickly surpassed it. So, in less than a minute following the torpedo detonation, the Lusitania exceeded her maximum flooding limit, and there was nothing that Captain Turner or anybody on the ship could do to keep the ship from sinking.
At the time of the torpedo detonation, Captain Turner wasn't on the bridge. He was actually heading to his stateroom at that time to retrieve something in his cabin. He was standing just outside his stateroom door when the torpedo exploded against the Lusitania's hull. As soon as he felt the explosion, he immediately turned around and began heading for the bridge. He was actually climbing up a flight of stairs when the Lusitania took this very sharp list to starboard. And the process of the ship rolling over to her starboard side was so sudden and quick that Captain Turner basically had to brace himself in this stairway to keep himself from falling. Once the ship stabilized with its 15-degree list to starboard, Captain Turner began to head to the bridge once again. And then, as he was proceeding towards the bridge, something else happened to the ship that Captain Turner could not believe.
Around 15 seconds after the torpedo had struck the Lusitania's hull, Captain Turner was still racing to the bridge when the unthinkable happened. Captain Turner said that he heard and felt a second massive explosion echo throughout the ship. Now, the funny thing about this explosion was there was nothing visible on the outside of the Lusitania to signal where this explosion came from, which could only mean one thing, that something inside the Lusitania had just exploded.
The source of this secondary explosion is a highly debated topic even to this day. Many people believed for a very long time, and I count myself among them, that they thought that it was the small arms munitions that the Lusitania was carrying in her cargo hold that exploded. However, they did many dives to the wreck of the Lusitania to try to figure out what the cause of this secondary explosion was, and they discovered that the cargo hold where these munitions were kept was completely intact, so it was not the small arms munitions that exploded. So with this evidence in mind, and with everything that I have been researching over the past couple of weeks, I tend to lean more towards that it was probably a steam line or a boiler explosion that caused this massive secondary explosion. And the reason I think this was because not long after the Lusitania experienced this secondary explosion, the ship lost nearly all steam pressure in her engines. And if it was a steam line or a boiler explosion that caused the secondary explosion, then this makes sense. The ship would lose almost all of its steam pressure if something like that exploded. But I'll get more into that in a few minutes. But yeah, for now, that is my theory on what caused the secondary explosion. But we will never be able to say with absolute certainty what caused this secondary explosion.
Captain Turner entered the Lusitania's bridge shortly after this second massive explosion was heard and felt all throughout the ship. Upon entering the bridge, Captain Turner's first order was to try to stop the ship as quickly as possible. He wanted to do this by throwing the Lusitania's engines into reverse, because by doing it this way, he would be able to stop the ship much more quickly than if he simply just shut off the Lusitania's engines and let the Lusitania coast to a stop. Now, the engine room did receive Captain Turner's order to throw the Lusitania's engines into reverse. However, when they received this order, they sent word back to the bridge that steam pressure within the Lusitania's engines had dropped from 195 psi down to only 50 psi. And with such a low amount of pressure in the system, the Lusitania's engines did not respond. The Lusitania's engines were now dead, so that means that the only way that Captain Turner had to stop the ship was to slowly but surely let her drift to a halt.
Now, the issue of not being able to stop the Lusitania presented two real problems to Captain Turner. Number one, he could not launch any of the Lusitania's lifeboats until the vessel had slowed down quite a bit. And the reason being was, if you tried to launch a lifeboat while a vessel like the Lusitania is still moving forward at 18 knots, well, the second this lifeboat touches the water, the forward momentum of the ship could rip the lifeboat apart, or at the very least, it would spill all the occupants in that lifeboat into the sea. So he had to wait until the Lusitania stopped before he could attempt to launch the lifeboats, or at the very least wait for the ship to slow down a bit. Now, he could go ahead and start the preparation process for the boats. He just couldn't lower them at this time. And the second issue that Captain Turner had to deal with due to the Lusitania's forward momentum was with the ship moving forward at this time, well, it put a lot more water pressure on the damaged sections of the Lusitania that were now below the waterline. They use a term called forced flooding to describe this effect. You know, if there's a damaged compartment below the waterline, then the increased pressure on that area due to the forward momentum of the ship would force more water into a vessel's hull than if the vessel was sitting still in the water. There are some estimates that believe that due to the Lusitania's forward momentum of 18 knots at this time, that as much as 100 tons of seawater was entering the Lusitania through its damaged compartments below the waterline. So, as you can see, the Lusitania was taking on water fast, and Captain Turner was in an incredibly desperate situation.
When Captain Turner realized that he wasn't going to be able to stop the Lusitania, what he decided to do next was to attempt to steer the Lusitania towards the Irish shoreline. His hope was that if he couldn't stop the ship, he may be able to.
Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels, wishing all of you a good day. I hope you all are doing well and are having a fantastic week. Now, in case you don't know it, but you probably do know it since you clicked on this video, we are now about to start another complete timeline series about another famous ship on this channel. And what ship?
It is Friday, May 7th, 19... It is the early...
When we last left the Lusitania, it was May 1st.
It is the early afternoon on May the 7th, 1915, and the RMS Lusitania is getting ready to complete another transatlantic voyage. It is Friday, May 7th, 1915, on board the RMS Lusitania. At exactly 2:10 p.m., a torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side in between the first and second funnel. At night, Lusitania
now hole in the ship's hull caused by a torpedo impact. I would say that when you factor in all these other variables, the weight of the water in those bulkheads dragged the ship over to her
to remember and
by the stairs when the Lusitania took this very sharp list to starboard. And the process of the ship rolling over to her starboard side was so sudden and quick that Captain Turner basically had to brace himself in this stairway to keep himself from falling. Once the ship stabilized with its 15-degree list to starboard, Captain Turner began to head to the bridge once again. And then, as he was proceeding towards the bridge, something else happened to the ship that Captain Turner could not believe.
Around 15 seconds after the torpedo had struck the Lusitania's hull, Captain Turner was still racing to the bridge when the unthinkable happened. Captain Turner said that he heard and felt a second massive explosion echo throughout the ship. Now, the funny thing about this explosion was there was nothing visible on the outside of the Lusitania to signal where this explosion came from, which could only mean one thing, that something inside the Lusitania had just exploded.
The source of this secondary explosion is a highly debated topic even to this day. Many people believed for a very long time, and I count myself among them, that they thought that it was the small arms munitions that the Lusitania was carrying in her cargo hold that exploded. However, they did many dives to the wreck of the Lusitania to try to figure out what the cause of this secondary explosion was, and they discovered that the cargo hold where these munitions were kept was completely intact, so it was not the small arms munitions that exploded. So with this evidence in mind, and with everything that I have been researching over the past couple of weeks, I tend to lean more towards that it was probably a steam line or a boiler explosion that caused this massive secondary explosion. And the reason I think this was because not long after the Lusitania experienced this secondary explosion, the ship lost nearly all steam pressure in her engines. And if it was a steam line or a boiler explosion that caused the secondary explosion, then this makes sense. The ship would lose almost all of its steam pressure if something like that exploded. But I'll get more into that in a few minutes. But yeah, for now, that is my theory on what caused the secondary explosion. But we will never be able to say with absolute certainty what caused this secondary explosion.
Captain Turner entered the Lusitania's bridge shortly after this second massive explosion was heard and felt all throughout the ship. Upon entering the bridge, Captain Turner's first order was to try to stop the ship as quickly as possible. He wanted to do this by throwing the Lusitania's engines into reverse, because by doing it this way, he would be able to stop the ship much more quickly than if he simply just shut off the Lusitania's engines and let the Lusitania coast to a stop. Now, the engine room did receive Captain Turner's order to throw the Lusitania's engines into reverse. However, when they received this order, they sent word back to the bridge that steam pressure within the Lusitania's engines had dropped from 195 psi down to only 50 psi. And with such a low amount of pressure in the system, the Lusitania's engines did not respond. The Lusitania's engines were now dead, so that means that the only way that Captain Turner had to stop the ship was to slowly but surely let her drift to a halt.
Now, the issue of not being able to stop the Lusitania presented two real problems to Captain Turner. Number one, he could not launch any of the Lusitania's lifeboats until the vessel had slowed down quite a bit. And the reason being was, if you tried to launch a lifeboat while a vessel like the Lusitania is still moving forward at 18 knots, well, the second this lifeboat touches the water, the forward momentum of the ship could rip the lifeboat apart, or at the very least, it would spill all the occupants in that lifeboat into the sea. So he had to wait until the Lusitania stopped before he could attempt to launch the lifeboats, or at the very least, wait for the ship to slow down a bit. Now, he could go ahead and start the preparation process for the boats. He just couldn't lower them at this time. And the second issue that Captain Turner had to deal with due to the Lusitania's forward momentum was with the ship moving forward at this time, well, it put a lot more water pressure on the damaged sections of the Lusitania that were now below the waterline. They use a term called forced flooding to describe this effect. If there's a damaged compartment below the waterline, then the increased pressure on that area due to the forward momentum of the ship would force more water into a vessel's hull than if the vessel was sitting still in the water. There are some estimates that believe that due to the Lusitania's forward momentum of 18 knots at this time, that as much as 100 tons of seawater was entering the Lusitania through its damaged compartments below the waterline. So as you can see, the Lusitania was taking on water fast, and Captain Turner was in an incredibly desperate situation.
When Captain Turner realized that he wasn't going to be able to stop the Lusitania, what he decided to do next was to attempt to steer the Lusitania towards the Irish shoreline. His hope was that if he couldn't stop the ship, he may be able to beach the ship on Ireland's coastline. He ordered the helmsman to turn the Lusitania to port. The helmsman did this, and the ship responded. He waited until the Lusitania's bow was evenly lined up with Ireland's shoreline. Then he told the helmsman to even the ship out and keep the Lusitania pointed at a lighthouse at the old head of Kinsale, which was a location directly in front of the Lusitania on Ireland's coastline. However, when the helmsman attempted to even the ship out, the Lusitania did not respond. At this time, the Lusitania's helm was now dead. All Captain Turner and the bridge crew could do was watch helplessly as the Lusitania's bow slowly turned away from Ireland, and the ship began once again to head further out to sea. It has now been 2 minutes since torpedo detonation.
Upon realizing the helm of the Lusitania was dead, Captain Turner realized that his ship was in serious trouble. At this time, he ordered a call for help to be sent out, and he also ordered to have all of the Lusitania's watertight doors closed. A good number of the watertight doors on the Lusitania were automatic. They could simply close these doors by throwing some switches on the bridge. And he also ordered to have the lifeboats of the Lusitania prepped, but he also told the crew to not launch the lifeboats yet because the ship was moving too fast to launch the boats. Just get them ready to be launched. That's all he told them to do. Now, given how much everything had already gone wrong with the Lusitania so soon after the torpedo impact, Captain Turner was concerned that the watertight doors, or the automatic ones anyway, wouldn't be able to close properly. So he ordered one member of his bridge crew to go down below and check to make sure that the watertight doors were closed. This crewman never returned.
It has been 3 minutes since torpedo detonation, and most of the passengers and crew on board the Lusitania now know that their ship is in serious trouble. Inside the Lusitania, people are running every which way to try to make their way up to the upper decks. Now, most of the people inside the Lusitania decide to use the ship's stairways in order to make their way up to the boat deck. However, not all do this. A good number of the people inside the Lusitania choose to try to make their way up to the boat deck by taking the Lusitania's elevator system. However, what the people who took the elevators inside the Lusitania don't yet realize is that another one of the Lusitania's critical systems is about to fail.
Just 4 minutes after the Lusitania was struck by the torpedo, there was no longer enough steam pressure within the Lusitania's systems to power the Lusitania's dynamos. And as a result of this, all of the Lusitania's electricity now failed, and the ship was plunged into total darkness. Now, what you have to remember is, despite the fact that it's the middle of the afternoon as the Lusitania is currently sinking, if you were in an area of the ship that didn't have any windows or portholes or anything like that, well, these parts of the ship, when the power failed, were plunged into total darkness. So, can you imagine trying to escape the interior of the Lusitania in pitch black? I mean, you couldn't see anything. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrifying this must have been. But if you think that was terrifying, well, for the passengers who were trying to escape the Lusitania by taking the ship's elevators up to the boat deck, well, they faced a whole other kind of horror. You see, there was one elevator on the Lusitania that was on its way up to the boat deck when the power failed, and when the power went out, this elevator became trapped in between floors. And the people within this elevator, they were stuck. There was nothing they could do. People who escaped the Lusitania said that they could hear screaming coming from inside the walls as the people who were in this elevator tried desperately to get out. But unfortunately, nothing could be done for these people trapped in the elevator. The Lusitania was sinking way too fast. Now, despite the fact that the Lusitania's power had by this point completely failed, the ship was still able to send out a distress call by means of the Marconi Wireless's emergency battery backup system. Now, by this point, a good number of ships had picked up the Lusitania's distress call and were beginning to head towards the ship. The distress call of the Lusitania was also picked up in Ireland, and Ireland's government was already beginning to send a distress call over to England and to the British Admiralty's base in London. So, slowly but surely, the entire world was starting to realize that something very serious had just happened with the RMS Lusitania.
Right around the time that all of the Lusitania's power went out, there were already a good number of passengers up on the Lusitania's boat deck waiting to be put into one of the ship's lifeboats. Now, the first boat that looked like it was about to be launched was lifeboat number 2, which was the first boat on the Lusitania's portside boat deck, right beside the bridge. There were a good number of passengers already climbing into this boat, and they were wanting to be lowered away. However, what these people didn't realize was that a great tragedy was about to happen at lifeboat number 2.
Now, before I tell you about the horrible tragedy that unfolded at lifeboat number 2 on the Lusitania, I first need to give you a little bit of a lesson in how these lifeboats are prepped and launched. Because if I don't tell you all this, you won't fully understand why what happened at lifeboat number 2 happened at all. You see, if a ship like the Lusitania isn't sinking, and the lifeboats are just simply secured on the ship's deck, they use a series of chains to hold the lifeboat on the deck, so if the ship encounters rough seas and all that and is rocking around, these lifeboats don't slide all over the place. So if they want to launch some lifeboats, the first thing they have to do is break these chains free. And then at this point, the lifeboat is just sitting on the deck through the power of gravity. You know, it's just resting there. And this lifeboat could slide around if the situation allowed it to. And then once these chains are free, the crew then use ropes that are secured to the Lusitania's davits, and then they hoist the lifeboat up, and they pull it out over the side, and then lower it over the ship's side using the davits and the ropes and so on and so forth. Now, with the Lusitania, remember, the ship is currently listing pretty heavily to starboard. And at lifeboat number 2, there are passengers there panicking and climbing into the boat and all that stuff. Now, the officer in charge of lowering lifeboat number 2 was trying to keep order at this location, and he was trying to tell all the passengers, hey, we can't lower this lifeboat, because number 1, the ship is still moving way too fast, and number 2, the ship is listing too far to the starboard side. So if we free this lifeboat, we're not going to be able to get the lifeboat over the side of the ship. It's just going to slide back down onto the deck if it's freed. And right as he was saying this to these passengers, he heard the sound of a hammer hit a chain. And in order to break these chains free and have the boat sit naturally on its own, you have to hammer down on a release pin, and this would break the chain. This officer heard a crewman whacking the release chain, and he knew in his head what was about to happen. This officer turned and looked at the crewman, and he said he literally saw the hammer in the guy's hand up in the air about to hit the chain. And before the word no could leave this officer's lips, he hit the chain and the chain snapped free. As soon as this happened, because the Lusitania is very heavy lift to starboard, this lifeboat slid free, came crashing down onto the deck, and crushed several people against the Lusitania's superstructure. And then, because by this point the Lusitania was down pretty far at the head as well, the lifeboat began to slide forward, injuring and killing countless more people as it headed for the bridge. Now, the lifeboat eventually came to rest right underneath the port side bridge wing, right around here my finger is. And Captain Turner was on the port side bridge wing when this went down, and he saw everything happen. I mean, I can't even put into words how disastrous this was. I mean, remember, this was the first lifeboat that was about to be prepped. And honestly, it was a bad omen for the things that were about to happen on board the Lusitania.
It has been roughly 5 minutes since the RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by German U-boat U-20 off of Ireland's southern coastline and started to sink. On the Lusitania's bridge, Captain Turner is waiting desperately for the ship to slow down enough so he can begin to launch the Lusitania's lifeboats. On the Lusitania's boat deck, the crew is working as fast as they can to prep all of the lifeboats, because what the crew want to do is, as soon as they get the all clear from the captain, they want to go ahead and have all of these lifeboats prepped, filled up with passengers, and ready to be launched as quick as possible. However, this was easier said than done for the crew working on the Lusitania's boat deck. One reason for this was because the ship was listing very heavily to starboard, so it was making it very difficult for them to prep the lifeboats. And the second reason that this was such a challenge for the crew on the Lusitania's deck is, believe it or not, the crew was short-handed. A good number of the crew members on the Lusitania that were trained in prepping the lifeboats were not on the boat deck. Now, in case you're wondering where they were at the time of the sinking, well, the truth of this is absolutely terrifying.
So the reason the Lusitania's crew, at least those on the boat deck, were short-handed during the sinking was because a good number of the ship's crew were working in the Lusitania's cargo hold at the time of the torpedo detonation. And the reason they were in the Lusitania's cargo hold, which was located in the bow part of the ship, was because where the ship was due to arrive in Liverpool the next day, the crew were down there prepping all of the passengers' luggage. That way they would have an easier time unloading it the next day when the ship docked in Liverpool. And the only way in and out of the Lusitania's cargo hold was by means of an electric elevator. So when the power went out, all of the crew members that were down there, they were trapped in the Lusitania's cargo hold. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been for them. And remember, like, there was no emergency stairway or nothing. When the power went out and that elevator stalled, those crew members were stuck. And unfortunately, none of them made it out. They were trapped in the cargo hold until the water reached them.
Now, at some point between 5 and 6 minutes following the torpedo detonation, Captain Turner told his crew that they could begin launching the Lusitania's lifeboats. He told his crew that the ship had slowed down enough for them to be able to successfully lower the boats away, despite the fact that the ship was still moving forward at a pretty high rate of speed at that time. So, if the ship was still moving quickly, why would he have ordered his crew to go ahead and launch the Lusitania's lifeboats, even though he surely knew the risks of launching the boats while the ship was still moving forward at a high rate of speed? Well, I honestly believe it was because from the Lusitania's bridge, Captain Turner could clearly see how fast the Lusitania was sinking. And I'm sure he was thinking that if they did not at least attempt to launch the lifeboats now, then there was a very good chance that the Lusitania would sink before any lifeboats made it off the ship.
Now, when Captain Turner told his crew that they could begin launching the Lusitania's lifeboats, he also made a point to tell them to only focus on launching the Lusitania's lifeboats from the ship's starboard side. He told them to not even bother with the lifeboats on the Lusitania's port side. And the reason he told them this was due to the Lusitania's very sharp list to starboard. So, when a ship is listing, this can cause one whole side of the ship's lifeboats to be basically unusable. So in the case of the Lusitania, where it was leaning very heavily to starboard, this means that the starboard side lifeboats were leaning out away from the ship because that was the direction the ship was listing. But on the port side, and this was the opposite direction that the ship was listing, due to the list, this would cause all these lifeboats to swing in towards the ship. So if you tried to lower these lifeboats down, they would just hit the deck. You know, they weren't over the water. And if somehow you could get the port side lifeboats over the side of the ship and try to lower them away, well, then those lifeboats would actually be grinding up against the Lusitania's hull. And if they're rubbing up against the hull while they're trying to launch these boats, then there's 1,000 things that could go wrong with this lowering away attempt. You know, these lifeboats could get snagged on the hull, and that could cause the lifeboat to capsize and spill all of its occupants into the sea. The boat could get damaged and sink when it hits the water. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons why you don't want to launch a lifeboat from the opposite side of a ship that a ship is listing. However, despite the fact that Captain Turner gave the crew this order, as the situation on the Lusitania became more and more desperate, a few crew members would try to launch some of the portside lifeboats anyway, despite what the captain said.
It has been roughly 6 minutes since torpedo detonation. At this point, the water has almost completely flooded all of the interior spaces in the Lusitania's bow section. Now, as a result of this rapid flooding of the Lusitania's bow, this caused a momentary evening out of the Lusitania's trim. Now, I'm not saying the Lusitania completely evened out. I'd say her 15-degree list to starboard decreased to somewhere between 5 to 10 degrees momentarily. But while this evening out of the ship did help a little bit in launching the Lusitania's lifeboats, it actually caused a good number of the Lusitania's passengers to get the wrong idea as to the true horror they were facing. A good number of the Lusitania's passengers saw this evening out of the ship as meaning that the Lusitania's watertight bulkheads were holding and the ship was no longer in danger of sinking. However, they would soon realize that that wasn't the case.
Over the course of the next 3 to 4 minutes, the full-on evacuation of the Lusitania officially began. It was during this time frame that the crew was doing everything they could to prep and launch as many lifeboats as possible. And yes, this includes the lifeboats on the port side of the ship, but more on that in a minute. Now, it was also during this time frame that more and more passengers were making their way up onto the Lusitania's boat deck. And once these passengers reached the deck, they were heading to whatever lifeboat they could to try to escape the ship on that boat. Now, one thing you need to remember here is the evacuation of the Lusitania was nothing like the evacuation of the Titanic, at least during the early stages of the sinking of the Titanic. There was a lot more chaos on the boat deck of the Lusitania than there was the Titanic, and this really is no surprise considering how fast the Lusitania was going down. Now, I'm not going to go as far and say that it was every man for himself type of chaos. There was some order on the Lusitania's deck during the evacuation. But still, when you compare it to how civil the evacuation of the Titanic was during the early stages of the sinking, yeah, the evacuation of the Lusitania was nothing like that. As all of these people tried to make their way up to the boat decks, they were running every which way, and the crew of the Lusitania was doing everything they could to keep order on the Lusitania's decks, while at the exact same time trying to prep and launch as many lifeboats as they could. And all the while, the situation of the Lusitania's sinking was getting more and more desperate.
So, with all of this information in mind, as you can imagine, trying to escape the Lusitania in one of the ship's lifeboats was not a very easy thing to do. And honestly, it didn't matter if you were trying to escape the Lusitania on the starboard or port side. Both sides had their dangers you had to deal with. Now, granted, it was more dangerous to try to escape the Lusitania on the port side than the starboard. But hey, the starboard side wasn't that safe either. And in case you're wondering what was so risky about trying to escape the Lusitania on the starboard side, well, I'll explain.
You see, when trying to escape the Lusitania from the ship's starboard side and get into one of the starboard side lifeboats, due to the Lusitania's very sharp list to starboard, this caused all of these lifeboats, when they were put onto the Lusitania's lifeboat davits, to swing out away from the ship. So what that means is, if you're standing on the Lusitania's deck and you want to try to get into one of these lifeboats, you would literally have to jump from the Lusitania's deck out over the sea and into this lifeboat. I mean, can you just imagine how terrifying this must have been? And depending on where you were and at what point in the sinking you were trying to escape the Lusitania, there was sometimes a distance from the deck to the lifeboat of around 4 to 5 feet that people would have to jump. I mean, I honestly can't even imagine how terrifying this must have been. Now, a good number of passengers were able to successfully make the jump into the lifeboat, but a good number of passengers also didn't make the jump. And when they attempted to do so, they tripped, fell from the lifeboat, and fell into the sea far below.
However, if you consider how dangerous it was for the Lusitania's crew to be trying to launch the ship's lifeboats from the Lusitania's starboard side, well, I would argue that it would be near, if not completely impossible, to launch any of the Lusitania's lifeboats from the port side, given how far to starboard the Lusitania was listing. There were several attempts by the Lusitania's crew to launch some of the port side lifeboats from the Lusitania's deck. However, what this crew had to do first was muscle the boat over the ship's side and then attempt to lower it away. Almost every single lifeboat that was launched from the port side ended up capsizing due to the boat rubbing up against the Lusitania's hull. There was only one boat that was successfully launched from the Lusitania's port side, which you're seeing now in this animation. However, on its way to the sea, this boat ended up capsizing several times and spilled most of its occupants into the water. The boat was successfully launched, however, most of its occupants did have to swim back into the boat after it touched down. The occupants in this lifeboat were very lucky, to say the least.
So, ultimately, how did the evacuation of the Lusitania end up turning out? Was the crew successful in launching a good number of the ship's lifeboats, and were they successful in saving a good number of those that were on board the Lusitania on the day of the sinking? Well, while it is true that the crew was able to launch some of the ship's lifeboats before the ship went down, and while it's also true they were successful in saving a good number of those who were on board the ship on the day of the sinking, as a whole, the evacuation of the Lusitania did not turn out all that well. You see, the Lusitania had 48 lifeboats on board, and with those lifeboats, the ship had more than enough lifeboats to hold everybody on board the ship without any issue whatsoever. However, due to the dire circumstances that everybody on board the ship was facing, and due to how fast the Lusitania was sinking, well, ultimately, the crew of the Lusitania were only able to launch 7 lifeboats before the ship went down. And of those 7 lifeboats, only 5 boats were launched without the lifeboats capsizing or having some kind of major issue during the lowering away process. Now, the 5 lifeboats that were launched successfully and without any major incident were launched from the Lusitania's starboard side. The other 2 lifeboats were launched from the port side. One of the port side lifeboats that was launched was the lifeboat that I showed earlier in that animation, and the other lifeboat that was launched, well, it was stored at the very back of the ship, and it ended up capsizing as the Lusitania sank. So while this boat did float away from the ship capsized, it was able to save lives. Lifeboat number 2 that we talked about in the last video, the one that got stuck underneath the Lusitania's portside bridge wing, this boat did end up floating away from the Lusitania. However, the rain holes in the bottom of the boat, these holes weren't filled up before the boat floated away, or they weren't capped. And this lifeboat ended up sinking shortly after the Lusitania went down.
It has now been 10 minutes since torpedo detonation, and the Lusitania's starboard list is starting to return with a vengeance. The vessel was rapidly leaning over to her starboard side. Also at this time, the Lusitania's forecastle, aka the deck above the ship's bow, was starting to submerge. Now, when the Lusitania's forecastle went underwater, the Lusitania's rate of sinking only accelerated from this point forward. Now, the ship was still moving forward by the power of its own momentum at this time. However, the ship was proceeding much more slowly than what she was before. At this time, the ship was moving forward at a speed of somewhere between 5 to 10 knots. Now, at this point in time, those still on board the Lusitania had to face a difficult choice. They could either decide to try to remain on the Lusitania and ride the ship down as she sinks, make an attempt to escape the ship in one of the Lusitania's lifeboats, or jump from the ship and try to swim away from the vessel.
Now, I don't know about all of you, but if I was a passenger on board the Lusitania trying to escape the ship, and I saw all the chaos that was unfolding with the lifeboats as the crew attempted to launch them, then I would go nowhere near those lifeboats. What I would try to do is simply walk to the bow of the Lusitania and then just swim away from the ship, and then take my chances in the water. I'm sure that I could find some debris to float on, or maybe get into a lifeboat that doesn't have a lot of people in it and it's already been launched. That would be what I would do. But still, even if you're going to try to swim away from a ship, there's always the risk of not being able to find a lifeboat, not being able to find something to cling to and float on in the water, because even if you are a very good swimmer, you can't swim forever. You're going to get tired eventually. So what's the one thing that you need before you swim away from a sinking ship? A life jacket. Now, it is true that the Lusitania did have enough life jackets on board for everyone, but you see, if you were on the deck at the time of the sinking, you would notice that a good number of passengers didn't have their life jackets on, and this was because all of the life jackets on the Lusitania were stored in each passenger's stateroom. So that means that if you wanted a life jacket to use to try to escape the sinking ship, you would have to venture inside the rapidly sinking Lusitania, go back to your cabin, get your life jacket, and then head back up to the boat deck. And as you can imagine, there weren't that many people on board the ship that wanted to take that risk. However, I did find the story of one passenger and his mission to go and retrieve a life jacket from his cabin that I thought was absolutely unbelievable.
The passenger that I'm referring to here is this man. His name was Dwight Harris. Now, Dwight Harris was so concerned about his safety during this particular voyage of the Lusitania, and he did not trust that the life jackets supplied to him by the Cunard Line were safe. So what he decided to do was, before he left on board the Lusitania in New York City, he went out and had a custom-made life jacket prepared for him, and he kept this life jacket stored in his stateroom. Now, at the time of the torpedo detonation, Dwight Harris wasn't in his cabin. He was out exploring the ship. And after the Lusitania began to sink, he hung out on the boat deck for a while. Around 10 minutes following the torpedo detonation, Dwight Harris made his way to a railing that was located just in front of the Lusitania's bridge, and was looking down from this railing at the Lusitania's forecastle deck. At this point, he noticed that the forecastle was beginning to dip beneath the surface. He decided at this time this was the moment to act. He had to do something now if he was going to try to save his life. But Dwight Harris also wanted nothing to do with the Lusitania's lifeboats. He considered those a death trap, considering everything he had just seen with the boats. So Dwight Harris slid down from the railing on the upper deck and stood on the Lusitania's forecastle deck. He watched the water slowly coming up the deck and thought to himself, okay, I'm just going to step off this deck and jump into the sea and swim away from the vessel. Now, keep in mind, at this time, Dwight Harris had not yet returned to his cabin to retrieve his life jacket. He wasn't wearing one at this moment. He was afraid to go back to his cabin to retrieve his custom-made life jacket because, due to how fast the ship was going, he was afraid of being trapped inside the vessel. A valid fear, if you ask me. However, just before he jumped into the sea, he thought better of it and thought to himself, I should probably go back to my cabin and retrieve my life jacket. So he walked back up onto a higher deck on the Lusitania and headed inside the ship back to his cabin to retrieve his life jacket. He commented later that this was very difficult considering how far down the ship had gone, and the list of the ship made it very difficult to walk in the interior spaces of the vessel. He was successful in retrieving his life jacket, and at this point he returned to the Lusitania's forecastle, which at this point was beginning to rapidly submerge, and simply jumped from the deck and into the sea. He said a giant wave showed up and began pushing him after the vessel. Once Dwight Harris swam clear of the Lusitania, he said he turned around and looked back at the ship. He said what stood out to him the most was the Lusitania's massive funnels as they slowly moved past him against the sky. Dwight Harris would end up surviving the sinking of the Lusitania.
It has now been 14 minutes since torpedo detonation. At this point in time, the Lusitania's forecastle was nearly completely submerged. However, even at this late stage in the sinking, Captain Turner, along with several of his officers, were still on the Lusitania's bridge.